The morning Hollis Napier decided to change everything began like most mornings that matter quietly without announcement in the kind of ordinary light that doesn't signal what's coming. It was 5:45 in the morning on March 14th, 2019. Hollis sat at the kitchen table in Harlan County, Kentucky with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched and a sheet of paper folded into quarters that he had touched many times. The paper was old enough that the creases had gone white, the fiber of it soft at the folds the way paper gets when it has been opened and closed by the same hands over many years. On the table beside it lay a printed auction notice, a single sheet, nothing special. Lot 7, Case IH 7140 Magnum. As is, no warranty. Hollis unfolded the paper and read the 11 questions his father had written by hand in 1987. He had read them before every equipment auction he had attended in the 25 years since his father passed. Not because he needed to. He had memorized them before he was 40. He read them because it was a ritual, and rituals have a different kind of value than information. They slow you down. They remind you who taught you to see. The phone on the table buzzed. Otis, 5:47 in the morning. Hollis looked at the screen. He looked at it long enough that it stopped buzzing. Then he folded the paper, slid it into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, and went to get his truck keys. He had driven to enough auctions to know that the decision about whether to bid on something is usually made before you get there. Not the final decision, not the number, but the orientation. You either go looking for a reason to buy, or you go looking for a reason to walk away. Those are two different kinds of attention, and they find two different kinds of evidence. Hollis had learned over the course of 4 decades of running a farm on margins that required real judgment that the most dangerous buyer at any auction was the one who didn't know which kind of looking he was doing. He drove east with the heater running and the radio off. By the time Hollis reached the auction grounds, the serious buyers had already done most of their work. It was 9:15. The morning light was the pale, flat kind that comes in early March in Kentucky, not warm yet, just present. Groups of men stood in clusters near the equipment they had already decided on, talking in the low, steady voices of people confirming rather than deciding. The energy of the place had already shifted from anticipation to execution. Hollis walked the rows. He passed a John Deere 8370R that 2 men in identical green hats were circling with the proprietary interest of people who had already made up their minds. He passed a grain cart that someone had repainted recently, the kind of touch that either means care or concealment, and he noted it without stopping. He passed a line of planting equipment arranged in order of declining condition, and he read that line the way you read a sentence looking for what it said about the operation that had assembled it. At the far end of Lot 7, separated from everything else by about 30 feet of open gravel, sat the Case IH 7140 Magnum. Nobody was standing near it. Hollis kept walking. He finished the row, turned at the end, and stood for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets. Then he walked back. He stopped 6 feet from the front of the tractor and looked at it the way his father had taught him to look at machines, not at the surface, not at the obvious, but at the structure underneath the surface. The rust on the hood had bled downward past the grill and onto the front axle, housing the kind of rust that accumulates over seasons of neglect. The cab glass was fogged from the inside, moisture trapped in a sealed space, the kind that builds up when a machine has not moved in months. The left rear tire was low, not flat, but noticeably soft. Under the wiper blade, someone had wedged a piece of cardboard with writing on it, "As is no warranty, dealer inspected." The words were meant as a warning. Hollis read them as information. He looked at the frame rails. They were straight. He looked at the front axle. It sat level, no sag, no twist. He looked at the hood beneath the rust on top of it. The metal had not buckled or warped. He walked around to the driver's side and climbed up just far enough to peer through the fogged cab door. The seat was cracked along the main seam. There was a water stain on the headliner, but the instrument cluster was intact. No cracked gauges, no missing switches, everything in its place. He dropped back down and stood for a moment in the gravel. There was one other person near the machine, a young man, maybe 27, wearing a Carhartt vest over a collared shirt, holding a clipboard with both hands and looking at it with the focused attention of someone trying to appear busy. He had the careful stillness of a person who had been told to stand somewhere specific and answer questions if asked and was hoping not to be asked. Hollis walked over to him. "What's the story on the 7140?" The young man found the sheet on his clipboard without looking up. He read from it in the flat voice of someone reciting rather than explaining. Transmission down, hydraulics failing, control module throwing fault codes that couldn't be cleared. Dealer had inspected it 6 weeks prior and quoted the owner $42,000 for a full rebuild. Owner had decided it wasn't worth it. Here it was. Hollis let the man finish. Then he said, "Did you look at this machine, not the paperwork, the machine itself?" The young man stopped. It was a short pause, less than 2 seconds, but it was the kind of pause that carries information. He looked up from the clipboard for the first time. "I wasn't the one who diagnosed it, sir." "I know, but did you look at it?" Another pause. "The machine was inspected per standard procedure." That was not an answer to the question Hollis had asked. Hollis knew that, and he thought the young man knew it too. "Thank you," Hollis said. He turned and walked away. He did not know the young man's name yet. He would learn it later. What he knew right now, standing in the gravel of Lot 7 on a cold March morning, was that the answer he had just received was the answer of someone who had seen something and been told it didn't count. That was a different kind of not knowing, and it meant something different about the machine. The bidding opened at $4,000. There were 3 other bidders. The crowd that gathered was small and unenthusiastic, the kind of crowd that assembles out of mild curiosity rather than genuine interest. The bidding moved slowly without the momentum that real competition creates. Hollis stood at the edge of the group and watched. Before he raised his card, he did something he had done before. Every bid he had ever placed on used equipment. He went through the 11 questions. Not the paper, he didn't need the paper. He went through them in his head, one by one, and he scored what he had been able to observe from 30 minutes of looking. 8 of the 11 he could answer. All 8 pointed in a direction he could work with. The frame was sound, the structure was honest, the rust was cosmetic, the instrument cluster was intact, which told him something about how the cab had been kept, which told him something about how the machine had been regarded. The low tire was not a flat, which meant the bead had probably held. The fog on the glass meant moisture but not flooding. 3 questions he could not answer yet. They required the machine to be running. They required time and attention he could not apply in a parking lot. He raised his card at $6,000. Nobody followed. $6,200. Final. He owned it. The man standing next to him shook his head slowly, not unkindly. "You just bought yourself a pile of iron Napier." It was not a judgment. It was what the evidence suggested to a reasonable person. Hollis didn't disagree with the man's reading of the evidence. He just had access to a different set of questions. The flatbed rental took 2 hours to arrange. While he waited, Hollis sat in his truck with the heater running and called Otis back. Otis answered on the first ring. He had been waiting. The conversation that followed was not a fight, which in some ways made it harder. A fight has a rhythm you can manage. What Otis offered instead was patience, the careful, pre-assembled patience of a man who had prepared his argument in advance and intended to deliver it without raising his voice. Otis was 34 years old and worked for an agricultural consulting firm in Columbus, Ohio. He spent his days analyzing the balance sheets of farms across 3 states, identifying inefficiencies, recommending consolidations, projecting outcomes. He was good at it. The irony was not lost on Hollis that his son made his living advising other people's farms while spending considerable energy trying to convince his father to liquidate their own. Otis talked about the loan payment due in April. He talked about the price of corn over the past 18 months. He used the phrase capital reallocation, which Hollis understood to mean selling, and the phrase operational restructuring, which Hollis understood to mean more selling. These were not dishonest words. They were accurate descriptions of the financial situation. Hollis did not dispute the numbers. 6,200 is money we don't have to lose, Dad. I didn't lose it. You don't know that yet. I know enough to bid on it. There was a long pause on Otis's end. Not the pause of someone who had run out of arguments, but the pause of someone recalibrating. When Otis spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, had lost some of its prepared quality, and found something closer to the real thing underneath. 2 weeks, Otis said. If in 2 weeks you can show me it's repairable, we have a different conversation. If you can't, then we sit down and talk about the farm. Hollis agreed to those terms. It was a fair offer and he knew it. But there was something in the exchange that stayed with him on the drive home with the flatbed. Something he turned over without arriving at a conclusion. Otis had not set the deadline because he believed in the process. Otis had set the deadline because he was afraid. Afraid of the loan, afraid of the season, afraid of the thing Hollis had been resisting for 2 years now, the conversation about whether the farm would outlast Hollis himself. Hollis understood that fear more precisely than Otis knew. He just handled it differently. He got the tractor home on the flatbed late that same afternoon. The light was already going orange by the time he got it unloaded and into the shop. He did not reach for a wrench. He did not open any panels. He walked around the machine twice in the overhead light of the shop slowly with his hands behind his back, the way you walk around something you are not yet ready to touch. Then he climbed into the cab, sat in the cracked seat, and turned the key to the run position. He listened. The system cycled. The gauges swept. He gave it 30 seconds. Then he turned the key the rest of the way. The engine turned over with the reluctance of something that had been sitting too long. It caught unevenly the idle rough for the first 30 seconds, the temperature gauge sitting cold. But it caught. It ran. Hollis sat in the cracked seat and watched the gauges and kept his hands in his lap because he was listening, and listening requires stillness. A machine with a genuinely failed power shift transmission and a dying control module does not start this cleanly. That was the first thing. Hollis wrote nothing down. He just sat with it. He let the engine run until the temperature gauge found its operating range. Then he shut it down and climbed out. He stood in the shop for a moment in the cooling silence. The last of the day's light had gone from the high windows. He turned on the workbench lamp, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and at the top of the first page, he wrote a single word, doesn't. He sat with that for a moment. Then he crossed it out and wrote, doesn't match. That was all. That was the beginning. He went inside. He ate supper. He did not call Otis back that evening because he had nothing to report yet. And Hollis had a long-standing habit of not reporting until he had something worth saying. At 11 o'clock, he went back to the shop. He couldn't have said exactly what took him back. It wasn't insomnia. He slept well as a rule. It wasn't anxiety. He was not by nature an anxious man. It was something closer to the feeling he sometimes got at the end of a day when he knew there was a job unfinished, not a job that required tools, but a job that required attention. He pulled the shop door shut behind him and stood for a moment in the cold looking at the machine under the single overhead light. Then he did something he had not done in 25 years. He took the folded paper out of his breast pocket and opened the back of it. He had never had a reason to look at the back. The 11 questions were on the front, and the front had always been sufficient. But standing in the shop that night for no reason he could name, he turned it over. His father had written one sentence on the back in the same blue ink he had used for the questions, though this ink had faded more. There was no date. When things don't fit, don't look for the answer. Look for the right question. Hollis stood with that for a long time. The shop was quiet around him. The machine sat in the light, patient and inert, offering nothing. He refolded the paper, put it back in his pocket, found a new composition notebook on the shelf above the workbench, the kind with the black and white speckled cover that he used for seed records and equipment notes. He opened it to the first page and wrote at the top, "Things that don't fit." Then he left the rest of the page blank, put the notebook down, and turned off the light. He was back in the shop at 6 the next morning. He started the engine, let it warm, then worked through a sequence he would repeat every morning for the next several days. PTO engagement, hydraulic remotes, full range, all detent positions. Then he put the machine in gear. It moved, not smoothly, not well. The engagement was harsh. The mid-range gears ground in a way that was unpleasant to hear, and the upper ranges refused to hold at anything above a crawl. But it moved. It crawled forward in low range with the resistance of something fighting against itself but not broken. Hollis noted this without expression. He put it in reverse. The machine crawled backward. He shut it down and sat for a moment in the idle silence of the shop. Then he opened the composition notebook and wrote below the heading he had made the night before. Machine moves, transmission not dead, transmission starving. At the end of day 2, Otis called to check in, not to talk to count. There was an efficiency to the call that Hollis recognized, the efficiency of a man managing a timeline rather than having a conversation. 12 days, Otis said. I know. Do you have anything? Not yet, I have questions. A pause. Questions aren't going to satisfy the bank, Dad. No, Hollis agreed. They're going to satisfy me first. The bank comes after. After he hung up, Hollis sat at the kitchen table with the composition notebook open in front of him. He read what he had written. Then he added one more line at the bottom of the page, not a technical observation, but a question, the kind of question that sits above the machinery and looks down at it from a different angle. Who did what to this machine, and why did no one ask that before I did? He closed the notebook. He was almost ready to go back to the shop. He was almost ready to start opening things up. But first he went to the cab one more time. He opened the storage compartment behind the operator's seat, the one he had checked on day 1 and found empty. He looked at it again. The felt liner at the back of the compartment had come loose at one corner, bowing slightly away from the metal wall behind it, creating a narrow gap maybe 2 fingers wide. Hollis looked at that gap. He thought about reaching into it. Then he didn't. He stepped back down from the cab and closed the door. He wasn't ready yet. He had learned over many years of working on machines that evidence is most useful when you already understand enough to know what you're looking at. If he reached into that gap now, he might find nothing, or he might find something he couldn't yet interpret correctly. He needed to understand the fluid system first. He needed to know what he was looking for before he looked. That moment would come on day 8, and what he found behind that piece of felt liner would turn out to be the document that explained everything, not the wiring, not the sensors, not the fluid, but the human decision that had set all of it in motion. But that was 8 days away. Tonight there was still the notebook and the 11 questions in one sentence written in faded blue ink on the back of a page that had stayed folded for 25 years. Hollis turned the shop light off and walked back toward the house. The night was cold and clear, the kind of March night in Kentucky where you can see more stars than you expect. He stopped once on the gravel path between the shop and the house and looked up at them for a moment. He was 61 years old. He had been asking questions about machines since before he could drive. He had been asking questions about this particular machine for 2 days. He did not have answers yet. That was fine. He had learned the hard way more than once that the urgency to have answers is the enemy of actually finding them. The machine would tell him what it knew. He just had to be patient enough to keep listening. He went inside. He put the coffee on for the next morning. He set the composition notebook on the kitchen table where he would see it first thing. 12 days. Otis had given him 12 days. He thought that was going to be enough. On the 3rd morning, Hollis connected the code reader. It was an older unit, not dealership software, but it communicated well enough with the Case IH system to pull everything stored in the control module. Hollis sat in the cab with the reader plugged in and watched the numbers come up on the small screen, writing each one by hand onto the yellow legal pad he had brought from the bench. He wrote slowly and in order, numbering each code as it appeared, giving each one its own line. When the scan finished, he had 17 entries on the page. He took the legal pad inside, set it on the kitchen table beside the Case IH diagnostic guide he had ordered years ago and kept on the shelf with his service manuals, and he went through the codes one by one with a cup of coffee that actually got drunk this time. What he found reading through the diagnostic descriptions with the careful attention of someone who was not looking to confirm a conclusion, but to understand a pattern, was that almost every code on the list was a secondary fault, not a primary failure signal, not the kind of code a component generates when it breaks, but the kind of code a component generates when it is being deprived of something it needs: pressure, flow, signal. The codes were not saying these systems have failed. They were saying these systems are not receiving what they require to function. Hollis circled 4 of them in red pen. They came from different sensors in different parts of the machine, but they all pointed through different paths toward the same underlying variable: hydraulic pressure in the transmission circuit. He sat with those 4 circled codes for a while. He had seen this pattern before, though not in a machine. In 2004, his father had been admitted to Harlan General with what the attending physician called heart failure, a diagnosis based on a cluster of symptoms that 2 weeks of treatment had done nothing to improve. The cardiologist who finally got involved asked a different set of questions and ordered different tests, and found that what looked like a failing heart was actually a heart being systematically deprived of electrolytes it needed to maintain rhythm. The organ was not broken, it was starving. 2 years of treatment aimed at the wrong target had been preceded by a diagnostic process that had stopped asking questions one step too early. Hollis looked at his 4 circled codes and wrote in the composition notebook, "Not broken, starving." He went back out to the shop. The fluid sight glass on the Case IH 7140 is mounted low on the transmission, housing easy to miss if you are not looking for it. Hollis found it and checked the level. It was low, noticeably below the full mark, short by roughly 2 quarts. He noted it without drawing any conclusions because 2 quarts low does not generate 17 fault codes. That gap was meaningful but not sufficient. He drew a sample from the sump using a clean baster and transferred it into a glass jar. He held the jar up to the light coming through the shop window. The color was wrong. Anyone who has worked around Case IH equipment understands what high-tran fluid looks like. It is a specific amber red, almost translucent, when clean with a particular way of catching light. What Hollis held up to the window was darker. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. A brownish cast, a murkiness that should not have been there, and a faint surface sheen that fresh fluid does not produce. He brought the jar to his nose. Then he set it down. That was not high-tran. He could not say yet exactly what it was, but he could say with certainty what it was not, and what it was not was the only fluid that should have been in that sump. He wrote in the notebook, "Wrong fluid, not high-tran. Who put it in, when?" The transmission filter came out the following morning. The housing date stamp told him it had never been replaced, not once in the entire service life of this machine. On a tractor this age and with the hours showing on the dash, that was a serious maintenance lapse by itself. But the filter media was the real document. At the bottom of the filter housing, in the material that had accumulated over what appeared to be years of operation without a change, there was a fine metallic residue. Almost powdery, a grayish bronze color that Hollis recognized without needing to look it up. Clutch material. Friction material from the power shift clutch packs worn away and suspended in the fluid as fine particles. This is what happens when clutch packs slip over a long period. The Case IH7140 uses a shared sump-1 reservoir that feeds both the power shift transmission's clutch engagement circuit and the external hydraulic circuit for the remotes, the hitch, and the steering assist. Hytran carries a specific friction modifier package engineered to allow the wet clutch packs inside the transmission to grip and release cleanly. Without those modifiers, the clutch surfaces begin to slip against each other rather than locking. The slipping generates heat. The heat accelerates the breakdown of whatever fluid is present. The breakdown produces metallic debris that circulates through the entire shared system, fouling valve bodies, contaminating solenoids, interfering with pressure sensor readings, and generating fault codes throughout. What looked like simultaneous transmission failure, hydraulic failure, and control module failure was actually one problem expressed everywhere at once. Hollis stood over the filter for a long time. He had the debris, he had the wrong fluid, he had the fault codes pointing to pressure, he had a transmission that moved but didn't shift correctly. What he did not have was the explanation for the origin. A machine doesn't put the wrong fluid in itself. Somewhere behind all of this was a human decision, and he suspected the record of that decision still existed somewhere. Now he was ready to go back to the felt liner. He climbed into the cab, opened the storage compartment, and reached into the gap that had been waiting since day 2. His fingers found the edge of something stiff. He worked it out carefully, pulling against the slight resistance of age and compressed space. A manila envelope, standard size, soft along one edge where moisture had touched it, not damaged, just marked by time. Inside, a composition notebook folded in half and several loose pages tucked alongside it. On the cover of the notebook, written in black marker in the careful script of a man who had been taught to write clearly, F. Sloan Field Equipment Log. Below that, in smaller letters, in a different pen, if found, please return to Virgie Sloan R2 Harlan County. A phone number followed. Hollis sat in the cracked seat and opened the notebook. 2 handwriting styles. The first covering entries from 2009 through the spring of 2016 was orderly and deliberate. Fluid changes recorded to the hour with the specific fluid designation written out in full, each time not abbreviated, not assumed. Filter replacements noted. A 2013 entry about a sensor replacement, the same sensor number that appeared in Hollis's list of fault codes. A 2014 observation about wear on the front drive shaft yoke, inspected, greased, and monitored over subsequent entries. This was the record of a man who understood that the log he was keeping had value beyond his own use, that it was a communication to whoever came after him. Then in the spring of 2016, the handwriting changed. Shorter entries, longer gaps between them. The careful specificity of the first writer giving way to something more hurried, less certain, the record of a person doing their best in unfamiliar territory. And then dated July 2016, this fluid low on check, added approximately 3 quarts, used universal hydraulic, didn't have Hytran on hand. Hollis read that entry 3 times. The first time he read it as information. The second time he read it as cause. The third time he read it as the portrait of a moment, a hot afternoon, a fluid level that needed addressing, a shelf that had the wrong thing on it, a decision made in 30 seconds by someone who almost certainly did not know that in this particular machine, in this particular system, the difference between the right fluid and the nearest available substitute was the difference between a machine that worked and a machine that spent 3 years slowly destroying itself. The entries after July 2016 told the story in fragments. Longer warm-up times noted without explanation. A comment about rough engagement, a line about the hitch behaving strangely, and then the final entry written in 2018 in the same uncertain hand, dealer coming to look at it, shifting bad all ranges, hydraulics not right. After that, nothing. The rest of the notebook was blank. Hollis sat in the cab of that machine for a while without moving, the notebook open on his knee, the shop quiet around him. The dealer had come, had connected their diagnostic equipment, had read 17 fault codes covering the transmission, the hydraulic system, and the control module, had assessed the worn clutch material and the contaminated fluid and the fouled solenoids and the failing pressure sensors, and had quoted $42,000 for a full rebuild. Nobody, not the operator, not the dealer's technician, had traced the cascade back to one line in a maintenance log from 3 years prior. Hollis noted the phone number on the inside cover of the notebook and went back inside. The next morning, he drove to the dealership. He asked to speak with whoever had signed the diagnostic report on the 71400. The service writer made a call. Hollis waited in the customer area for 8 minutes, which he spent reading a product brochure he had no interest in, because standing and waiting in a room like that requires something to hold. Vesterkaudel came out from the service corridor and introduced himself without unnecessary warmth. He was 48, Hollis estimated, with the manner of a man who had delivered difficult news to disappointed customers enough times that the process had become efficient. He was not unkind. He was organized. Hollis told him what he had found: the fluid sample, the filter debris, the maintenance log entry from July 2016. Vester listened without interrupting. When Hollis finished, Vester looked at the list of fault codes Hollis had placed on the table between them. "We used factory diagnostic software," Vester said. 17 fault codes across the transmission and hydraulic systems represents a machine that requires comprehensive remediation. "Did anyone check what fluid was in the sump?" A brief pause. "Fluid analysis isn't part of the standard diagnostic protocol." "Why not?" Vester looked at Hollis with the expression of a man who has not been asked that particular question before, or at least not in that tone. "Because the fault codes identify the location of the failure. That's what the protocol is designed to do." "The protocol finds where the problem is expressing itself," Hollis said. "It doesn't ask why it's expressing itself there." Nothing happened for several seconds. Vester did not agree, and he did not disagree. He sat with the statement in a way that suggested it had landed, that it had found a gap in something he thought he had fully assembled. "Thank you for coming in," Vester said finally. Hollis nodded and stood. He was at the door when he heard a voice behind him, quieter than the ambient noise of the service area, directed specifically at him. He turned. The young man from the auction was standing at the edge of the service corridor, a shop rag in his hands. Eldon Stamper. Hollis now had the name from the service desk signage. Eldon was looking at him with the expression of a person who has been waiting for a specific moment and is not sure whether it has arrived. "Did you find anything?" Eldon asked. Hollis stopped. He looked at Eldon for a moment. "You know what I found." Eldon glanced toward the service corridor behind him. "When we had that machine in for inspection, I pulled a fluid sample. The color didn't look right to me. I wrote it up. They told me fluid appearance wasn't within the scope of the diagnostic." "What did you think?" "I thought it should be checked further." Eldon looked down at the rag in his hands. "But it wasn't my call." Hollis took out his phone and read Eldon the number waiting while Eldon entered it. 2 weeks, Hollis said. "Call me." Eldon nodded. He didn't say anything else. He went back into the service corridor. Hollis went back to his truck. That evening, Hollis called the number from the maintenance log. Virgie Sloan answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was the voice of someone in their 70s who had learned to hold difficult things steadily without collapse because time had required it of her repeatedly. Hollis explained who he was and how he had come to have her number. He told her about the machine, about what he had found in the maintenance log. When he finished, there was a silence on the line that was not uncomfortable, just full. "Ferris kept that log from the day we bought the machine," Virgie said. "He believed in the record. He used to say that if you're going to use something hard, you owe it the honesty of knowing what you've done to it." "The second handwriting," Hollis said carefully. "That was your son, Garfield. He came back after Ferris passed to manage things. He's a software engineer. He didn't know the equipment." She paused. "He tried." "I know he did," Hollis said. Another silence. Then Virgie asked, "Can it be fixed?" I think so. I think I know exactly what's wrong with it. Virgie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had something in it that Hollis could not quite name. Ferris would have liked to know that. He worried about that machine after he got sick. He knew he wasn't going to be the one to keep it right. Hollis did not know what to say to that, so he said what was true. The log he kept is the reason I was able to figure it out. Without those records, I might have gone in the wrong direction. He heard her exhale slowly on the other end of the line. On the 12th night, Hollis sat at the workbench with the repair list in front of him. One page, ordinary pencil, drain, flush twice, new filters, clean the valve body, test the solenoids, replace the pressure sensor. He looked at that list for a long time. Then he wrote at the top of the page, 3 quarts, 3 years, $42,000. He stared at that for a moment. Then he crossed it out and wrote something different. The difference is not in the machine. The difference is in who was willing to ask. He closed the notebook. Tomorrow the work would begin. The repair list, when Hollis finally wrote it out in full on the morning of day 13, fit on a single page of the composition notebook. He had expected it to feel like more. 12 days of observation, 17 fault codes, a maintenance log covering 10 years of 2 men's working lives, and the answer came down to 1 page written in ordinary pencil. Nothing underlined. Drain the sump completely. Flush twice with fresh fluid. New filters both housings. Clean the valve body by hand. Test the solenoids. Replace the pressure sensor. That was it. That was the entire distance between a condemned machine and a working one. Hollis read the list twice, then set the notebook down and went to get his tools. Otis was still at the farm. He had driven down from Columbus the night before, arriving after dark with a bag over his shoulder in the careful politeness of a man who had decided sometime during the 4-hour drive to stop arguing and start watching. He had not announced that decision. He had just shown up and asked where Hollis kept the extra blankets, and that was how Hollis knew something had shifted. In the morning, Otis appeared in the shop doorway with 2 cups of coffee while Hollis was laying out his tools on the workbench. He set 1 cup at the edge of the bench without a word. Hollis nodded. Otis pulled a shop stool to the side wall and sat down. "What do you need me to do?" Otis asked. Hollis looked at his son for a moment. Otis was wearing the same collared shirt he wore for client meetings, with a pair of his father's old work gloves that he had found on the shelf near the door. The gloves were too large for his hands. He had put them on anyway. "Grab that flashlight," Hollis said. "The big one. Point it where I tell you." They worked through the morning without much conversation. Hollis drained the sump, and Otis held the light. Hollis pulled the filters, and Otis handed him the new ones from the parts box on the bench. When the valve body came out, Hollis carried it to the workbench and worked on it under the lamp, while Otis sat nearby watching, occasionally asking a question when something didn't make sense. Hollis answered each question directly and without elaboration, the way he answered most questions, giving exactly what was needed and nothing extra. At some point around mid-morning, Otis asked, "How did you know where to look?" Hollis considered the question while he worked a small pick through one of the valve body galleries. "I didn't know where to look," he said. "I knew what questions hadn't been asked yet." Otis was quiet for a moment. "That's not the same thing." "No," Hollis agreed. "It's better." The valve body took most of the morning. Each gallery showed Hollis what 3 years looked like, preserved in a thin film of varnish on every surface. The wrong fluid had touched a record of slow accumulation that announced itself only in the aggregate. He cleaned each gallery with the correct solvent and a set of small picks, working with patience he did not have to manufacture. He had been doing this kind of work for 40 years, and the patience was not a virtue he had cultivated. It was simply what the work required. The 2 solenoids came out in the early afternoon. Hollis bench tested them before cleaning running current through each one and watching the response time. Both were slow, both were inconsistent. He cleaned them with the correct solvent, dried them thoroughly, tested them again. The response times came back into specification. He set them aside on a clean cloth. Otis had gone inside for lunch and come back with sandwiches. They ate in the shop, sitting on opposite ends of the workbench, looking at the disassembled transmission components laid out between them. "You really think this works?" Otis said. It was not quite a question. "I know what's wrong with it," Hollis said. "If I know what's wrong with it, I can fix what's wrong with it." "And you've been sure of that since the auction?" "I've been sure of that since day 3. Hollis picked up his sandwich. "That's why I kept going." Otis looked at the components on the bench. He was quiet for a while in the particular way he got quiet when he was rearranging something in his thinking, a habit Hollis had noticed in him since he was a boy, the way he went still and inward when the model he had been carrying stopped matching the evidence in front of him. "I called you at 5:47 in the morning," Otis said finally, "the day of the auction." "I know. You didn't answer." "No. You already knew you were going to bid on it." Hollis looked at his son. "I knew I was going to look at it. Those are different things, too." Otis almost smiled. "Yeah," he said, "I'm starting to understand that." They finished the fluid fill late in the afternoon, the third and final fill, with fresh high trim brought to the correct level. Hollis checked everything twice. He replaced both filter elements in their cleaned housings and torqued them, not by feel but by specification. He had looked the torque values up that morning, even though he had done this enough times that he probably had them in his hands. Probably was not the same as certainly, and the work deserved certainty. The pressure sensor was the last thing. Hollis had gone to the dealership alone that morning before Otis was up before the repair work started. He had driven the 40 minutes and the gray early light arrived when the parts counter opened and waited while the man behind the counter looked up the part number. The man found it and typed it in. Then he looked up. "What machine is this for?" 7140 Magnum. Something changed in the man's expression, a small recognition. "We had one of those come through here a few weeks back. Somebody brought it in for diagnosis. $42,000 quote." He paused. "Someone bought it at auction, I heard. You know how that turned out." Hollis set the money on the counter. "You'll know in a few days," he said. He drove home with the sensor in his coat pocket. Now, with everything back in place, Hollis cleared all 17 stored fault codes from the control module. The screen went clean. He sat for a moment with his key still in his hand and the cleared display in front of him, and he was aware of something he did not quite have a word for. Not satisfaction, not vindication, something quieter than either of those. The recognition that a thing which had been wrong for a long time was about to be given the chance to be right. He turned the key. The engine came up immediately, no hesitation, no rough idle, none of the reluctant catch he had heard on day 1. The temperature climbed steadily on the gauge. Hollis sat in the cracked seat with both hands in his lap and watched the instruments and did not touch anything else for 10 minutes. Otis stood in the open shop door with his arms folded against the cold air coming in. He was watching his father. He was not watching the machine. When the transmission fluid temperature reached operating range, Hollis put the machine in gear. It moved forward the way a machine moves when it has everything it needs. Not tentative, not labored, clean and immediate and right. Hollis shifted through the lower ranges, and each one engaged with the solidity of a mechanism functioning as designed. He shifted into the mid-ranges. They held. He worked up through the full power shift range in sequence, and every gear caught and every gear held, and there was no grinding and no hesitation and nothing that didn't belong. He took it out of the shop and into the yard. The late afternoon light was the kind of pale gold that belongs to early March in Kentucky, low and long, putting shadows out ahead of everything. Hollis drove the machine. The length of the gravel lane shifted direction, drove it back. He engaged the loader hydraulics against the bucket he had hooked up for resistance and worked them through their full range. Everything answered. He parked it in the yard and shut it down and climbed out. Otis was still standing in the shop doorway watching. He had not moved. "How much?" Otis asked. His voice was even, but something in it was different from every conversation they had had in the past 2 weeks. Hollis thought for a second. "Parts and fluid, around $340. Otis nodded very slowly, the nod of a man absorbing something rather than acknowledging it, and the dealer said 42,000. The dealer read the codes and stopped, Hollis said. The codes told the truth. Nobody asked what the codes were responding to. Otis stood with that. The sun was going down behind the tree line west of the house, and the yard was getting cold, and neither of them moved. I owe you something, Otis said finally. You don't. I do. I was going to make you sell this place. Hollis looked at his son for a long moment. There was no reproach in his expression, no satisfaction at being right. You were scared, he said. That's different from being wrong. Otis looked down at the oversized work gloves still on his hands. He had been wearing them all day. He had forgotten they were there. He pulled them off and held them, not sure what to do with them. Can I ask you something, what he said? Go ahead. How did you know at the auction, before you knew anything about the fluid or the codes, how did you know it was worth $6,000? Hollis was quiet for a moment. He looked at the machine sitting in the fading light. I didn't know it was worth $6,000, he said. I knew it was worth 3 questions I hadn't been able to answer yet. The price was just what it cost to get those questions answered. Otis was quiet for a long time after that. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the last of the consulting firm precision that Hollis associated with his work conversations. He sounded the way he had sounded 20 years ago, before Columbus, before spreadsheets. I want to learn how to do that, Otis said. What you do, the way you look at things. Hollis looked at his son. The man standing in front of him was 34 years old, wearing office clothes and his dead grandfather's work gloves in the yard of a farm he had spent 2 years trying to dissolve. Hollis felt something that he did not name because naming it seemed like it might make it smaller. You already started, he said. You held the light for 8 hours today. That's the beginning. 3 weeks later, Vester Caudle drove out to the Napier farm. Hollis did not know he was coming. He was in the shop doing routine maintenance on the grain drill when he heard a truck on the gravel and came out to find a dealership service truck parked in the yard. Vester was standing beside it, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the 7140 with an expression Hollis had not seen on him during their first meeting. The previous expression had been the professional composure of a man defending a process. This one was something more complicated. Hollis wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. Parts counter told me, Tony, Vester said. He did not apologize for coming unannounced. He did not explain himself at length. He just looked at the machine. She running. Yes. Since when? 2 weeks ago. Vester was quiet. He walked slowly around the front of the tractor, looking at it the way Hollis had looked at it in the auction yard, though Vester was looking for different things. He was looking for what he had missed. Hollis let him look. The fluid analysis, Vester said finally. Eldon Stamper flagged the sample color. I didn't know that until last week. It never made it to me. Got filtered at intake because fluid appearance isn't a diagnostic criterion in the standard protocol. Hollis said nothing. It should be, Vester said. Yes, Hollis agreed. Vester stopped at the front of the machine. He was a careful man. Hollis could see that the kind of man who had built a competent operation by following good procedures with consistency. The procedures were not bad. They were incomplete. There was a difference, and Vester understood it, and the understanding was sitting on him with some weight. If Eldon had been allowed to pull on that thread, Vester said slowly, we would have found the same thing you found. Probably in a day, Hollis said. Maybe less. Vester nodded. I'm going to change the intake protocol. Fluid appearance gets documented and flagged for review on any machine, showing multiple concurrent hydraulic and transmission codes. He paused. I wanted you to know that. Hollis looked at the older man. This was not a concession made for appearances. Vester had driven 40 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon to say something he did not have to say to a man he could easily have avoided for the rest of his professional life. That meant something. I appreciate it, Hollis said. They stood for a moment in the yard, 2 men on opposite sides of a mistake that neither of them had made, and both of them had inherited from a system that had simply never been asked the right question. Then Vester shook Hollis's hand, got back in his truck, and drove away. Eldon Stamper called exactly 14 days after Hollis had given him the number at 7 in the evening, while Hollis was washing up after supper. Hollis dried his hands and sat down at the kitchen table. He told Eldon the results. The complete picture, what the fluid contamination had done, what the actual repair had cost, what was now running in his east field. Eldon listened without interrupting. When Hollis finished, Eldon was quiet for a long time. "I was right about the oil," he said at last. He did not say it with satisfaction. He said it the way you state a fact that you have been sitting with for a long time and are finally allowing yourself to confirm. "You were," Hollis said, "and you reported it. The system didn't follow it up. Those are two separate failures and only one of them is yours." "I still let it go," Eldon said. "When they dismissed it, I wrote it off." "You did," Hollis said. "That's worth knowing about yourself." Another silence. When Eldon spoke again, something in his voice had changed. The careful detachment of an employee was gone. He sounded younger and more uncertain and more honest. "What would you have done in my position?" Hollis thought about it seriously before he answered. "I don't know," he said. "I never worked inside a system like that. I worked on my own farm where I was the only system. That's a different situation." He paused. "But I know what it costs to let something go when you shouldn't have. And I think you know too." "So what do I do?" "I can't answer that," Hollis said. "You know what kind of person you want to be better than I do. The question is whether you're willing to build toward that from where you are." Eldon called him twice more over the following months, the second time to say that he had enrolled in the agricultural engineering program at Eastern Kentucky University. He would keep working at the dealership while he studied. It would take longer that way. He did not seem to mind. The letter from Virgie Sloan arrived on a Thursday, 6 weeks after Hollis had called her number from the cab of the 7140 on the 8th night of his investigation. It came in a plain white envelope with her return address written in the upper corner in the careful cursive of a woman who had learned penmanship in a time when penmanship was taught as a discipline. Hollis opened it at the kitchen table with his coffee. Virgie wrote that she had told Garfield about the outcome. Garfield was in Louisville. He had taken the call quietly the way Virgie wrote. He took most hard things without display, letting them settle. When she told him what Hollis had found and what it had cost to fix, Garfield had been silent for a long time. Then he asked, "So it was my fault?" Virgie had told him no. She had been clear about the distinction. He had not known. Not knowing is not the same as being responsible. The machine had been starving for something specific, and he had given it the closest available substitute without understanding that in this particular application, close was not close enough. That was not negligence. That was the gap between general knowledge and specific knowledge, a gap that exists in every technical field and claims a quiet toll in equipment, in money and time, usually without anyone understanding where the losses actually began. Garfield had listened to all of this. Then he had asked for Hollis's name. Virgie wrote, "I gave it to him. He said he would like to call you someday. I told him he didn't have to. He said he knew. I think he will call anyway." Near the end of the letter, in a paragraph that was shorter than the others, Virgie wrote about Ferris. Her husband had kept that maintenance log, she explained, because he believed in the record, not because he expected anyone to read it, because the keeping of it was itself an act of respect for the machine and for whoever came after him. Ferris had believed in a way that was difficult to explain to people who didn't share it, that careful work leaves a residue, that the quality of attention a person brings to a task outlasts the task itself in ways you cannot always trace. He had written those entries over 15 years with the understanding that he was building something even if he could not say exactly what. Hollis folded the letter and held it in his hands for a moment. He thought about Ferris Sloan writing those pages in the cab of a machine he would never see run again, the careful notation of fluid types and service hours, the attention given to things that seemed small at the time. He thought about Garfield Sloane standing in a farm supply store on a hot July afternoon, looking at a shelf and making the best decision he knew how to make with the information he had. He thought about Eldon Stamper holding a fluid sample up to the light in a dealership service bay and knowing something was wrong and writing it down and having it disappear before it reached anyone who could act on it. He thought about how far a single afternoon decision can travel through time and how many hands it passes through and how the people those hands belong to almost never know they are part of the same story. He put the letter in the plastic document sleeve with Ferris's maintenance log. He put them both in the glove box of the 7140 beside the pages he had been adding in his own handwriting since March. Every service since the auction was recorded there, the fluid type written out in full, each time the filter part numbers, the hours, the date. The same way Ferris had done it. Not because Hollis thought about Ferris while he wrote, because this was simply the correct way to keep a record. The tractor went into the east field for the first time in the third week of April. Hollis drove it out in the morning, still cool, the soil just reaching the right temperature for planting. The machine moved through the field without complaint, the power shift engaging cleanly through every range, the hydraulics responsive on the planter lift. Hollis worked 300 acres over 4 days, and the 7140 did not give him a single problem. Otis came down for the weekend while the planting was still going. He stood at the edge of the field in the afternoon and watched his father make passes. At the end of a run, Hollis pulled up near the headland and Otis walked over. "Dad," Otis said, "I want to stay more involved with the farm." Hollis looked at his son. Otis's hands were in his pockets and his face was serious in the way it got when he had arrived at a conclusion through a process and was not willing to unwind it. "You have a job," Hollis said. "I can do both for a while, then we'll see." He paused. "I've been giving other people's farms advice for 6 years. I think I should understand ours first." Hollis thought about that. He did not answer quickly. He looked out over the field at the rows going back toward the tree line, at the soil turned and waiting. He thought about his father and the 11 questions, and about the folded paper with the sentence on the back that he had never read until the night he needed it. He thought about how certain kinds of knowledge travel not in courses or credentials, but in attention paid close enough and long enough to become instinct. "You can start with this maintenance log," Hollis said. "Learn what's in it, learn why each entry matters. Then we'll talk about what comes next." Otis nodded. "Okay." "And leave the dress shoes in Columbus." Otis looked down at his feet and then back up with something that was almost a smile. "Yeah," he said, "I know." That fall, the 7140 Magnum ran the harvest alongside 2 other machines, the oldest machine in the line and the most reliable. It did not need attention. It did not generate fault codes. It did not ask for anything beyond what it had been given, which was the right fluid and clean filters in a log kept in the glove box that now contained 2 handwriting styles. People in Harlan County kept asking Hollis about the machine, and he kept telling the story, and the story kept having its effect, not loudly, not officially, but in the way that useful things travel through farming communities from neighbor to neighbor, from conversation to question, to slightly different question asked at the next service appointment. Bertie Sawyer avoided a $28,000 mistake. Leland Elgin saved his feeder house. Others reclaimed equipment that had been written off not because Hollis had given them answers, but because he had given them permission to ask differently. Hollis did not keep track of these outcomes. He heard about some of them and did not hear about others. He was not trying to build anything beyond his own farm, his own practices, his own record. When people asked him what the lesson was, he told them the same thing every time. He said the machine had been telling the truth all along. Every rough shift, every fault code, every sluggish cylinder, it was all connected, and it all traced back to one decision made on a summer afternoon by a man who was doing his best with what he knew. And then he said the thing that seemed to land differently for different people, but that landed eventually for almost everyone. "The machine wasn't broken," Hollis said. "It was being honest about what had been done to it. The problem was that nobody slowed down long enough to listen. There is something in that observation that belongs to more than tractors and service bays in rural auction lots. The most expensive diagnosis is often not the one that requires the most sophisticated equipment. It is the one delivered by someone who stopped asking questions one question too soon, who looked at a complicated picture and reached for the most expensive explanation rather than the most complete investigation. A credential is not the same as accuracy. A high quote is not the same as a correct one. And sometimes the most important evidence in a complex failure is not located inside the machine at all. It is folded inside a plain envelope behind a piece of loose felt in the back of a cab that has been sitting dark and cold, waiting without urgency for someone patient enough to reach all the way in. The tractor ran that fall. It ran the following spring. It will run this season. And every hour it logs is a record of what becomes possible when someone decides that something not adding up is worth more than accepting the first answer that fits.